Found by Washington Irving among the papers of the late Diedrich Knickerbocker. A pleasing land of drowsy-headed was, of dreams that wave before the half-shut eye, and of castles in the clouds that pass, forever flushing round a summer sky. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the annual retelling of the legend of Sleepy Hollow. Looks like you just finished up our famous walking tour. You folks must be ready for the story, so sit right down. We represent the Historical Society of Sleepy Hollow and Tarrytown. A few of us are of Dutch extraction and have grown up hearing our parents and grandparents speaking English, highlighted with a bit of Dutch. You may hear it occasionally as we tell the story. My name is Effie, and I am a mother, a farm wife, a homemaker. Have I forgotten an occupation or two?
Undoubtedly. And I'm Grace. I'm a washerwoman. Dirt doesn't stand a chance with me.
Clearly. Hello, my name is Kate and I'm a seamstress. Need a sock mended? Well, a few more of us will be along later, but for now, it's us three. Start us off, Grace.
Of course. In one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, at that broad expansion of the river called by the ancient Dutch navigators the Tappan Zee, there lies a small market town, which is known by the name of Tarrytown.
This name was given, we are told, in former days by the good housewives of the adjacent country from the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days.
Not far from this village, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a little valley among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it, with just murmur enough to lull one to repose. The occasional whistle of a quail tapping or tapping of a woodpecker is almost the only sound that ever breaks in upon the uniform tranquility.
Oh, if ever I should wish for a retreat whither I might steal from the world and its distractions, I know of none more promising than this little valley.
From the listless repose of the place and the peculiar character of its inhabitants, who are descendants from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow.
A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang over the land and to pervade the very atmosphere. Some say that the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement.
Certain it is, the place still continues under the sway of some witching power that holds a spell over the minds of the good people, causing them to walk in continual reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs, are subject to trances and visions, and frequently see strange sights and hear music and voices in the air.
The whole neighborhood abounds with local tales, haunted spots, and twilight superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare far oftener here than in any other part of the country.
The dominant spirit, however, that haunts this enchanted region is the apparition of a figure on horseback, without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head had been carried away by a cannonball in some nameless battle during the Revolutionary War. He is ever and anon seen by the country folk, hurrying along in the gloom of night, as if on the wings of the wind.
His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance.
Indeed, certain of the most authentic historians of these parts allege that, the body of the trooper having been buried in the churchyard, the ghost rides forth to the scene of battle in nightly quest of his head. The rushing speed with which he sometimes passes along the hollow is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak.
The specter is known at all the country firesides by the name of the Headless Horseman of Sleepy Hollow.
It is remarkable that the visionary propensity I have mentioned is not confined to the native inhabitants of the valley, but is unconsciously imbibed by everyone who resides there for a time.
However wide awake they may have been before they entered that sleepy region, they are sure, in a little time, to inhale the witching influence of the air and begin to grow imaginative, to dream dreams and see apparitions.
I mentioned this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for in such little retired Dutch valleys, found here and there in the great state of New York, that population, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvement sweeps by them unobserved.
In this by-place of nature there abode, in a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, a worthy wight.
Wait. What is a wight?
Oh, a living being, a creature.
Is that cleared up now? Oh, I hope that was worth the wight. The wait. A worthy wight of the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried, in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity.
He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the mind as well as for the forest, and sent forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and country schoolmasters.
The name of Crane was suited to his person. He was tall but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs, hands that dangled a mile out of his sleeves, feet that might have served as shovels, and his whole frame most loosely hung together.
His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears, large green glassy eyes, and a long snipe nose, so that it looked like a weathercock perched upon his spindle neck to tell which way the wind blew.
To see him striding along the profile of the hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for some scarecrow escaped from a cornfield.
Let's talk about his schoolhouse. It was a low building of one large room, rudely constructed of logs, the windows partly patched with leaves of old copybooks. It stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a brook running close by.
From hence, the low murmur of his pupils' voices, perusing their lessons, might be heard on a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive.
When school hours were over, he would escort some of the smaller ones home, particularly the ones who happened to have pretty sisters, or good housewives for mothers, noted for the comforts of the cupboard.
Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils. The revenue arising from his school was small, and would have been scarcely sufficient to furnish him with daily bread.
For he was a huge feeder.
And though lank, he had the dilating powers of an anaconda. But to help out his maintenance, he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged at the houses of the farmers whose children he instructed.
With these he lived successively a week at a time, thus going the rounds of the neighborhood with all of his worldly effects tied up in a cotton handkerchief.
That all this might not be too onerous on the purses of the rustic patrons, who are apt to consider the costs of schooling a grievous burden.
And schoolmasters as mere drones.
He had various ways of rendering himself both useful and agreeable. He assisted the farmers occasionally in the lighter labors of their farms, helped to make hay, mended defenses, took the horses to water.
He found favor in the eyes of the mothers. He would sit with a child on one knee and rock the cradle of another with his foot for whole hours together.
In addition to his other vocations, he was the singing master of the neighborhood, picked up many bright shillings by instructing the young folks in psalmody.
Ah,
Thus, by diverse little makeshifts in that ingenious way which is commonly called by hook and by crook, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought, by all who understood nothing of the labor of head work, to have a wonderfully easy life of it.
The schoolmaster is generally a man of some importance in the female circle of rural neighborhood, being considered a kind of idle gentlemanlike personage, of vastly superior taste, and accomplishments to the rough country swains, and indeed inferior in learning only to the parson.
His appearance, therefore, is apt to occasion some little stir at the tea table of a farmhouse, and the addition of an extra dish of cakes or sweetmeats, or peradventure the parade of a silver teapot.
Our man of letters, therefore, was particularly happy in the smiles of all the country damsels, gathering grapes for them from the wild vines that overran the surrounding trees, reciting for their amusement all the epitaphs on the tombstones, or sauntering with a whole bevy of them along the banks of the adjacent mill pond. All the while, the more bashful country bumpkins hung sheepishly back, envying his superior elegance and address.
From his wayfaring life, he was also a kind of roving gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted with satisfaction. He was, moreover, esteemed by the women as a man of great erudition, for he had read several books quite through,
and was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly and potently believed.
His appetite for the marvelous and his powers of digesting it were equally extraordinary, and both had been increased by his residence in this spellbound region.
It was often his delight, after his school was dismissed in the afternoon, to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover bordering the little brook by his schoolhouse, and there peruse old Mather's direful tales until the gathering dusk made the printed page a mere mist before his eyes.
Then he wended his way by swamp and stream and woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered. And every sound of nature at that witching hour fluttered his excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill from the hillside, the boding cry of the tree toad, or the dreary hooting of the screech owl.
Woo-hoo. Another of his sources of fearful pleasure was to pass long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives, as they sat spinning by the fire with a row of apples roasting and sputtering along the hearth, and listened to their marvelous tales of ghosts and goblins.
And particularly the tale of the headless horseman, or galloping Hessian of the hollow, as they sometimes called him.
But if there was a pleasure in all this, while snugly cuddling in the chimney corner of a chamber that was all of a ruddy glow from the crackling wood fire, it was dearly purchased by the terrors of his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path amidst the dim and ghastly glare of a snowy night!
How often was he appalled by some shrub covered with snow, which like a sheeted spectre beset his very path.
How often did he shrink with curdling awe at the sound of his own steps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dread to look over his shoulder.
And how often was he thrown into complete dismay by some rushing blast of wind howling among the trees, in the idea that it was the galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings.
All these, however, were mere terrors of the night, phantoms of the mind that walk in darkness.
And daylight put an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in despite of the devil and all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the whole assembly of the witches put together, and that was
A woman. Among the musical disciples who assembled one evening each week to receive his instruction in psalmody was
Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only child of a substantial Dutch farmer.
lass of fresh 18, ripe and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's peaches, and universally famed, not merely for her beauty, but her vast expectations.
She was withal little of a coquette, as might be perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions, as most suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold and a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the country round.
Ichabod Crane had a soft and foolish heart towards the female sex, and it is not to be wondered at that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eyes, more especially after he had visited her in her paternal mansion.
Old Baltus Van Tassel was a perfect picture of a thriving, contented farmer. Within the boundaries of his farm, everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, but not proud of it. He showcased the hearty abundance rather than the style in which he lived.
His farm was situated on the banks of the Hudson, in one of those green, sheltered, fertile nooks in which the Dutch farmers are so fond of nestling. A great elm tree spread its broad branches over it, at the foot of which bubbled up a spring of the softest and sweetest water.
Hard by the farmhouse was a vast barn, every window and crevice of which seemed bursting forth with the treasures of the farm.
Sleek, unwieldy porkers for grunting in repose and abundance of their pens, from whence sallied forth now and then troops of suckling pigs. Regiments of turkeys were gobbling, and a stately squadron of snowy geese and whole fleets of ducks were sailing on an adjoining pond.
The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon this sumptuous promise of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in his belly and an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed in a comfortable pie and tucked in with a coverlet of crust. The geese were swimming in their own gravy, and the ducks pairing cozily in dishes like snug married couples with a decent competency of onion sauce.
In the porkers, he saw carved out the future sleek side of bacon and juicy, relishing ham. Not a turkey he saw, but he beheld it daintily trussed up and with a necklace of savory sausages.
As the enraptured Ichabod fancied all this in his heart, he yearned after the damsel who was to inherit these domains.
Nay, his busy fancy already realized his hopes and presented to him the blooming Katrina, with a whole family of children mounted on top of a wagon with household claptrap, with pots and kettles dangling beneath. And he beheld himself bestriding a pacing mare with a colt at her heels, setting out for Kentucky or Tennessee or the Lord knows where.
Then he entered the house. The conquest of his heart was complete. From the moment Ichabod laid his eyes upon these regions of delight, his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel.
And he had to encounter a host of fearful adversaries, the numerous rustic admirers who beset every portal to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in the common cause against any new competitor.
Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade of the name of Abraham, or, according to the Dutch abbreviation, Brom. Brom Van Brunt was the hero of the country round, which rang with his feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, curly black hair and a bluff but not unpleasant countenance, having a mingled air of fun and arrogance. From his Herculean frame and great powers of limb, he had received the nickname of Brom Bones, by which he was universally known.
Brom Bones was dexterous on horseback. He was foremost at all games and competitions, and with the ascendance of bodily strength, which one always acquires in rustic life, he was the umpire of all disputes, setting his hat to one side and giving his decisions with an air and tone that admitted of no gainsay or appeal. He was always ready for either a frolic or a fight.
But Brom had more mischief than ill-will in his composition. With all his overbearing roughness, there was a strong dash of waggish good humor at bottom. He had 3 or 4 boon companions who regarded him as their model, and at the head of whom he scoured the country, attending every scene of feud or merriment for miles round.
Sometimes his crew would be heard dashing along past the farmhouses at midnight, with whoop and holler like a troop of Cossacks, and the old dames, startled out of their sleep, would listen for a moment till the hurry-scurry had clattered by, and then exclaim, "Aye, there goes Brom Bones and his gang." The neighbors looked upon him with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill, and when any madcap prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, they always shook their heads and warranted Brom Bones was at the bottom of it. This rantable hero was...
Wait. What does rantable mean?
Oh, it means wild, reckless, boisterous.
This rantable hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina for the object of his uncouth gallantries. And though his amorous toyings were something like the gentle caresses and endearments of a bear, yet it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his advances were signals for rival candidates to retire.
Such was the formidable rival with whom Ichabod Crane had to contend. A stouter man than he would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. He had, however, a happy mixture of pliability and perseverance in his nature.
To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits at the farmhouse.
Walt Van Tassel was an easy, indulgent soul. He loved his daughter better even than his pipe, and like a reasonable man and an excellent father, let her have her way in everything.
His notable wife, too, had enough to do to attend to her housekeeping and manage her poultry, for, as she sagely observed, ducks and geese are foolish things and must be looked after, but girls can take care of themselves.
Thus, while the busy dame bustled about the house, honest Balt would sit smoking his evening pipe, and Ichabod would carry on his suit with the daughter by the side of the spring under the great elm, or sauntering along in the twilight, that hour so favorable to the lover's eloquence.
He who wins 1,000 common hearts is therefore entitled to some renown, but he who keeps undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero.
Thus, a deadly feud gradually arose between Brom Bones and the schoolmaster of Sleepy Hollow.
Brom, who had a degree of rough chivalry in his nature, would have carried matters to open warfare and have settled their pretensions to the lady according to the mode of the knights errant of yore, by combat.
But Ichabod was too conscious of the superior might of his adversary to enter the lists against him. He had overheard a boast of Bones, that he would double the schoolmaster up and lay him out on the shelf of his own schoolhouse, and Ichabod was too wary to give him an opportunity.
There was something extremely provoking in this stubbornly peaceful system. It left Brom no alternative but to draw upon the funds of rustic vagary in his disposition and play off boorish practical jokes upon his rival.
To Bones and his gang of Rough Riders, Ichabod became the object of whimsical persecution. They plagued his hitherto peaceful domains. They smoked out his singing school by stopping me. They broke into the schoolhouse at night and turned everything topsy-turvy. Oh, the poor schoolmaster began to think all the witches in the country held their meetings there.
In this way, matters went on for some time without producing any material effect on the relative situations of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal afternoon, from whence he usually watched all the concerns of his little academic realm,
His scholars were all busily intent upon their books, or slyly whispering behind them, with one eye kept upon the master. A kind of buzzing stillness reigned throughout the schoolroom. it was suddenly interrupted by the appearance of a servant in tow-cloth jacket and trousers, a round-crowned fragment of a hat, and mounted on the back of a ragged, violed, half-broken colt.
The servant came clattering up to the school door with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a merrymaking or frolic to be held that evening at Mr. Van Tassel's. And having delivered his message with an air of importance, he dashed back over the brook and was seen scampering away up the hollow, full of the importance and hurry of his mission.
All was now bustle and hubbub in the formerly quiet schoolroom. The scholars were hurried through their lessons without stopping at trifles. Books were flung aside without being put away on the shelves. Inkstands were overturned, benches thrown down, and a whole school was turned loose an hour before the usual time.
The gallant Ichabod now spent an extra half-hour preening and brushing and furbishing up his best, and indeed only, suit of rusty black, and arranging his locks by a broken shard of looking-glass that hung upon the schoolhouse.
That he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier, he borrowed a horse from the farmer with whom he was then residing, a grouchy old Dutchman of the name of Hans van Ripper. Thus he gallantly mounted and issued forth like a knight-errant in quest for adventures.
But it is meet I should, in the true spirit of romantic story, give some account of the looks of my hero and his steed. The animal he bestrode was a broken-down plough horse that had outlived almost everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a hollow drooping neck, and a head like a hammer. His rusty mane and tail were tangled and knotted with burrs.
One eye was sightless and spectral, and the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. He must have had fire and metal in his day, if we may judge from the name he bore of Gunpowder.
He had, in fact, been a favorite steed of his master's, the bad-tempered Van Ripper, who was a furious rider and had infused very probably some of his own spirit into the animal.
Ichabod was a suitable figure for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups, which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle. His elbows stuck out like a grasshopper's. As his horse jogged along, the motion of his arms was not unlike the flapping of a pair of wings.
A small wool hat rested on the top of his nose, or his scanty strip of forehead might be called, and the skirts of his black coat fluttered out almost to the horse's tail. Such was the appearance of Ichabod and his steed as they shambled out of the gates of Hans van Ripper, and it was altogether such an apparition as is seldom seen in the broad daylight.
It was, as I have said, a fine autumnal day. The sky was clear and serene, and nature wore that rich and golden livery with which we always associate the idea of abundance. The forests had put on their sober brown and yellow, while some trees of the tenderer kind had been nipped by the frosts into brilliant dyes of orange, purple, and scarlet.
As Ichabod jogged slowly on his way, his eye ever open to every symptom of culinary abundance, ranged with delight over the treasures of jolly autumn. On all sides he beheld vast stores of apples, some hanging in opulence on the trees, some gathered in baskets and barrels for the market, and others heaped up in rich piles for the cider press.
Ooh, cider, that sounds good about now. Let's head to the tavern.
Women weren't allowed in taverns in 1790.
Oh, yes, they were. Entering through the side door, in special women's drinking rooms, often in the basement.
Oh, look, I see Rebecca and Hendrik, late as always.
Sorry we are late. Hello, I'm Rebecca, the midwife.
And I'm Hendrik, a farmer. How far had you gotten? We didn't miss the part about the frolic, I hope.
No, we were on apples. Apples in trees, in the cider press, baskets and barrels.
So, farther on, Ichabod beheld great fields of corn with golden ears that promised the amount of cakes and hasty puddings, and the yellow pumpkins lying beneath them, giving ample prospects of the most luxurious of pies. And then he passed the fragrant buckwheat fields.
And as he beheld them, soft anticipation stole over his mind of dainty slapjacks, well buttered, and garnished with honey or treacle by the delicate little dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel.
It was toward evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Lord Van Tassel, which he found thronged by the pride and flower of the adjacent country. Old farmers, a spare leathern-faced bunch in homespun coats and breeches, their brisk, withered little dames in close-crimped caps and long-waisted gowns and petticoats, and the young men in short, square-skirted coats with rows of stupendous brass buttons.
And buxom lasses, dressed almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting whereas straw hat or a fine ribbon or perhaps a white frock gave symptoms of city innovation. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the gathering on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mettle and mischief, in which no one but himself could manage. Brom was, in fact, noted for preferring vicious animals, for he held that a tractable, well-behaved horse was unworthy of a lad of spirit.
I pause now to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of our hero as he entered the stately parlor of the Van Tassel mansion. Not those of a bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious display of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch country tea table in this sumptuous time of autumn. There were heaps and platters of cakes of almost indescribable kinds. There was the tender Holy Kolyek.
Holy, what on earth is that?
Holy Kolyek, a small, ball-shaped cake made of sweetened dough and fried in lard, similar to a donut, and the crisp and crumbling cruller, sweet cakes and shortcakes and ginger cakes and honey cakes, and the whole family of cakes.
And then there were the pies, apple pies and peach pies and pumpkin pies, besides slices of ham and smoked beef, and moreover, delectable dishes of preserved plums and peaches and pears and quinces.
Not to mention broiled shad and roasted chickens, together with bowls of milk and cream, all mingled higgledy-piggledy, and heaven bless the mark. I want a breath and time to discuss this banquet as it deserves, but I am too eager to get on with the story.
Happily, Ichabod was not in so great a hurry and did ample justice to every dainty. He could not help rolling his eyes round him as he ate and chuckling with the possibility that one day he might be the lord of all this scene of almost indescribable luxury and splendor.
Then he thought how soon he'd turn his back upon the old schoolhouse and snap his fingers in the face of Hans Van Ripper and every other stingy patron.
Old Baltus Van Tassel moved about among his guests with a face dilated with contentment and good humor, round and jolly as the harvest moon. His hospitable attentions were brief, but expressive, being confined to a shake of the hand or a slap on the shoulder, a loud laugh, and a pressing invitation to fall to and help yourselves.
The sound of music from the common room summoned all to dance. The fiddler had been the roving orchestra of the neighborhood for more than half a century. His fiddle was as old and battered as himself. The greater part of the time he scraped 2 or 3 strings, accompanying every movement with the motion of his head and the stamping of his feet whenever a fresh couple were to start.
Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle. And to have seen his loosely hung frame in full motion and clattering about the room, well, you would have thought Saint Vitus himself, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. Ichabod was the admiration of all.
His partner in the dance was the lady of his heart, who smiled graciously to all his amorous oglings. All the while, Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in a corner.
When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folks, who with old Van Tassel sat smoking at one end of the covered porch, gossiping over the former times and drawing out long stories about the bar.
But all these were nothing to the tales of ghosts and apparitions that followed. The neighborhood is rich in legendary treasures of this kind. Local tales and superstitions thrive best in these sheltered retreats.
The immediate cause, however, of the prevalence of the supernatural stories in these parts was doubtless owing to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow.
There was a contagion in the very air that blew in from that haunted region. It breathed forth an atmosphere of dreams and fancies infecting all the land. Several of the Sleepy Hollow people were present at Van Tassel's and, as usual, were doling out their wild and wonderful legends.
Many dismal tales were told about funeral trains and mourning cries and wailings heard and seen. Some mention was also made of the woman in white that haunted the dark glen at Raven Rock, who was often heard to shriek on winter nights before a storm.
The chief part of the stories turned upon the favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the Headless Horseman, who had been heard several times of late patrolling the country and tethering his horse nightly among the graves in the churchyard.
The sequestered situation of the old church seems always to have made it a favorite haunt of troubled spirits. It stands on a knoll, surrounded by locust trees and lofty elms.
A gentle slope descends from it to a silver sheet of water bordered by high trees, and between them, views of the blue hills of the Hudson. To look upon its grass-grown yard, where the sunbeams seem to sleep so quietly, one would think that there, at least, the dead might rest in peace.
On one side of the church extends a wide woody glen, along which rushes a large brook among broken rocks and trunks of fallen trees. Over a deep part of the stream was thrown a wooden bridge. The road that led to it was thickly shaded by overhanging trees, which cast a gloom about it even in the daytime, and occasioned a fearful darkness at night. Such was one of the favorite haunts of the Headless Horseman.
The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts, how he met the horseman returning from his foray into Sleepy Hollow, and Brower was obliged to get up on the horse, seated right behind the horseman, how they galloped over bush and bramble, hill and swamp, until they reached the bridge. And then the horseman turned suddenly into a skeleton, threw Brower into the brook, and sprang away over the treetops with a clap of thunder.
This story was immediately matched by the thrice marvelous adventure of Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as a sort of roguish jockey. He affirmed that on returning one night from a neighboring village, He had been overtaken by this midnight trooper. He had offered to race with him for a bowl of punch and should have won it too, for Daredevil soundly beat the goblin horse. But just as they came to the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and vanished in a flash of fire.
All these tales, told in that drowsy undertone with which men talk in the twilight, sank deep in the mind of Ichabod. He repaid them in kind with large extracts from his invaluable author, Cotton Mather, and added many marvelous events that had taken place in his native state of Connecticut, and fearful sights which he had seen in his nightly walks about Sleepy Hollow.
The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families in their wagons and were heard for some time rattling along the hollow roads and over the distant hills. Some of the damsels mounted on pillions behind their favorite swains. Their light-hearted laughter, mingling with a clatter of hoofs, echoed along the silent woodlands, sounding fainter and fainter until it gradually died away, and the former scene of noise and frolic was all silent and deserted.
Only Ichabod remained behind, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, fully convinced that he was now on the high road to success.
What passed at this interview, I will not pretend to say, for in fact I do not know. Something, I fear me, must have gone wrong. He sallied forth after no very great interval, with an air quite desolate and crestfallen. Oh, these women! These women! Would that girl have been playing any of her coquettish tricks? Was her encouragement of the poor pedagogue all a mere sham to secure her conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I.
Let it suffice to say, Ichabod stole forth with the air of one who had been sacking a hen roost rather than a fair lady's heart, without looking to the right or the left to notice the scene of rural wealth on which he'd so often gloated. He went straight into the stable, and with several hearty cuffs and kicks, roused his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters in which he was soundly sleeping.
It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted, pursued his travels homewards along the sides of the lofty hills which rise above Tarrytown, and which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon.
The hour was as dismal as himself. Far below him the Tappan Sea spread its dusky and indistinct waters, with here and there the tall mast of a sloop rising quietly at anchor. In the dead hush of midnight, he could even hear the barking of a watchdog from the opposite shore of the Hudson.
Now and then, the long drawn-out crowing of a rooster would sound far, far off from some farmhouse away in the hills. No signs of life occurred near him, but occasionally the melancholy chirp of a cricket or the guttural twang of a bullfrog from a neighboring marsh.
The night grew darker and darker. The stars seemed to sink deeper into the sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt so lonely and dismal.
He was, moreover, approaching the very place where many of the scenes of the ghost stories had been laid. In the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree, which formed a sort of landmark, and towered like a giant above all the other trees. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, large enough to form trunks for ordinary trees, twisting down almost to the earth and then rising up again into the air.
As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistle was answered. Oh, but it was just a wind blast sweeping sharply through the dry branches.
As he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of a tree. He paused and ceased whistling, but on looking more narrowly, it was a place where the tree had been struck by lightning and the white wood laid bare.
Well, suddenly he heard a groan. His teeth chattered and his knees smote against the saddle. It was but the rubbing of one huge bough upon another as they were swayed about by the breeze. He passed the tree in safety, but new perils lay before him.
About 200 yards from the tree, a small brook crossed the road and ran into a marshy and thickly wooded glen known as Wiley Swamp. A few rough logs laid side by side served as a bridge over this stream. On that side of the road where the brook entered the wood, a group of oaks and chestnuts matted thick with wild grapevines threw a cavernous gloom over it.
As he approached the stream, his heart began to thump. He summoned up, however, all his resolution and gave his horse a half a score of kicks in the ribs and attempted to dash quickly across the bridge. But instead of starting forward, the perverse old animal made a lateral movement and ran broadside into the fence.
Ichabod, whose fears increased with the delay, jerked the reins on the other side and kicked lustily with the contrary foot. It was all in vain. His steed started, true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side of the road into a thicket of brambles.
The schoolmaster now bestowed both whip and heel upon the ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward, then came to a stop with a suddenness by the bridge that nearly sent his rider sprawling over his head.
Just at that moment, a splashy stomp by the side of the bridge caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. In the dark shadow of the grove, on the margin of the brook, he beheld something huge, misshapen and towering. It stirred not, like some gigantic monster ready to spring upon the traveler.
The hair of the affrighted pedagogue rose upon his head in terror. What was to be done? To turn and fly now was too late. Besides, what chance was there of escaping a ghost or goblin, if such it was, who could ride upon the wings of the wind? Summoning up a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, "Who are you?"
He received no reply. He repeated his demand in a still more agitated voice.
"Who are you?"
Still, there was no answer. Once more, he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder, and shutting his eyes, broke forth with an involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. Ah! Just then, the shadowy object of alarm put itself in motion, and with a scramble and a bound stood at once in the middle of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, yet the form of the unknown might now in some degree be ascertained. He appeared to be
A horseman of large dimensions and mounted on a black horse of powerful frame. Well, he made no offer of trouble or sociability, but kept aloof on one side of the road, jogging along on the blind side of old Gunpowder, who had now got over his fright and waywardness.
Ichabod, who had no relish for this strange midnight companion, and bethought himself of the adventure of Brom Bones with the galloping Hessian, now quickened his steed in hopes of leaving him behind. the stranger quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, thinking to lag behind. The other did the same. Ichabod's heart began to sink within him. He endeavored to resume his psalm tune, but his parched tongue clove to the roof of his mouth, and he could not utter a verse.
There was something mysterious in the moody and dogged silence of this persistent companion. It was soon fearfully accounted for. On mounting a rising ground, which brought the figure of his fellow traveler in relief against the sky, gigantic in height and muffled in a cloak, Ichabod was horror-struck on perceiving that he was headless.
But his horror was still more increased on observing the head, which should have rested on his shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. His terror rose to desperation. He rained a shower of kicks and blows upon Gunpowder, hoping by a sudden movement to give his companion the slip. But the specter started full jump with him. Away they dashed through thick and thin, stones flying, sparks flashing. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered in the air as he stretched his long, lanky body away over the horse's head in his eagerness of flight.
They had now reached the road which turns in off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, who seemed possessed with a demon, instead of keeping on the road, made an opposite turn and plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow shaded by trees where it crosses the bridge, and just beyond it swells the green knoll on which stands the whitewashed church.
As yet, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase. But just as he got halfway through the hollow, the girth of the saddle gave way, and he felt it slipping from under him. He seized it by the pommel and endeavored to hold it firm, but in vain. He had just time to save himself by clasping old Gunpowder round the neck when the saddle fell to earth. He heard it trampled underfoot by his pursuer.
For a moment, the terror of Hans Van Ripper's wrath passed across his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was hard on his haunches, and unskillful rider that he was, Ichabod had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on the other, and sometimes jolted up high on the ridge of his horse's backbone with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder.
An opening in the trees now cheered him with the hope that the church bridge was at hand. The wavering reflection of a silver star in the waters of the brook told him that this was not mistaken. He saw the walls of the church dimming glaring under the trees beyond. He recollected the place where Brom Bones' ghostly competitor had disappeared. If I can but reach that bridge, thought Ichabod, I am safe.
Just then he heard the black steed panting and blowing close behind him. He fancied he felt its hot breath. Another convulsive kick in the ribs, and old Gunpowder sprang upon the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks. He gained the opposite side. And now Ichabod cast a look behind to see if his pursuer should vanish, according to the rule, in a flash of fire and brimstone.
Just then he saw the goblin rising up in his stirrups in the very act of hurling his head at him. Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but too late. It encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash. he was tumbled headlong into the dust. Meanwhile, Gunpowder, the black steed, and the goblin rider all rushed by like a whirlwind.
The next morning, the old horse was found without his saddle, soberly cropping grass at his master's gate. Ichabod did not make his appearance at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but no Ichabod. The boys assembled at the schoolhouse and strolled idly by the banks of the brook, but no schoolmaster.
Hans von Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness about the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set on foot, and after diligent investigation, they came upon his traces. In one part of the road leading to the church was found the saddle trampled in the dirt.
Just beyond the bridge, where the water ran deep and dark, was found the hat of the unfortunate Ichabod, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin.
The brook was searched, but the body of the schoolmaster was not to be discovered. Hans van Ripper, as executor of Ichabod's estate, examined the bundle of Ichabod's worldly effects. These consisted of 2 shirts and a half, 2 neck scarves, a pair or 2 of knitted stockings, an old pair of corduroy small clothes, a rusty razor, a dog-eared book of psalm tunes, and a broken pitch pipe.
As to the books and furniture at the schoolhouse, they belonged to the community, excepting Cotton Mather's History of Witchcraft, a New England Almanac, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling.
These magic books were forthwith consigned to the flames by Hans van Ripper, who, from that time forward, determined to send his children to school no more, observing he never knew anything good to come from this reading and writing.
The event caused much speculation at the church on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips were collected in the churchyard, at the bridge, and at the spot where the hat and pumpkin had been found. The stories of Brower, of Bones, and a whole budget of others were all called to mind. And when they had diligently considered them all and compared them to the symptoms of the present case, they shook their heads and concluded Ichabod had been carried off by the galloping Hessian.
As he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, nobody troubled his head any more about him. The school was removed to a different quarter of the hollow, and another pedagogue reigned in his stead.
An old farmer who'd been down to New York on a visit several years after, and from whom this account of the ghostly adventure was received, brought home the intelligence that Ichabod Crane was still alive, that he'd left the neighborhood partly through fear of the goblin and Hans von Ripper, and partly in mortification at having been suddenly dismissed by the heiress.
He had changed his quarters to a distant part of the country, had kept school and studied law at the same time. He had been admitted to the bar, turned politician, electioneered, written for newspapers, and finally was made a justice of the civil court.
Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, was observed to look exceedingly knowing whenever the story of Ichabod was relayed, and always burst into a hearty laugh at the mention of the pumpkin, which led some to suspect it. He knew more about the matter than he chose to tell.
The old country wives, who are the best judges of these matters, maintain to this day Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. It is a favorite story often told in the neighborhood round the winter fire. The bridge has become an object of awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered so as to approach the church by the border of the mill pond.
The schoolhouse, being deserted, soon fell to decay and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate pedagogue. Many a plowboy loitering homeward of a still summer evening has fancied Ichabod's voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune among the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow.
Wait, there's a postscript from the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, who writes,
The preceding tale is given in almost the precise words in which I heard it at a corporation meeting in the ancient city of Manhattan, at which were present many of its wealthiest and sagest citizens.
The storyteller was a pleasant, shabby, gentlemanly old fellow in pepper and salt clothes with a sadly humorous face. He made such efforts to be entertaining. When the story was concluded, there was much laughter and approbation, particularly among 2 or 3 of the deputy aldermen, who had been asleep the greater part of the time.
there was, however, one tall, dry-looking old gentleman with beetling eyebrows who maintained a grave and rather severe face throughout, now and then folding his arms, inclining his head, and looking down on the floor as if turning a doubt over in his mind. He was one of your wary men, who never laugh but upon good grounds, when they have reason and law on their side.
When the mirth of the rest of the company had subsided and silence was restored, he leaned one arm on the elbow of his chair and sticking the other akimbo, demanded, with a slight but exceedingly sage motion of the head and contraction of the brow, what was the moral of the story and what went it to prove?
The storyteller, who was just putting a glass of wine to his lips as a refreshment from his toils, paused for a moment, looked at his inquirer with an air of infinite deference, and lowering the glass slowly to the table, observed that the story was intended most logically to prove
That there is no situation in life but has its advantages and pleasures, provided we will but take a joke as we find it.
That he that runs races with goblin troopers is likely to have a rough riding of it.
ergo, for a country schoolmaster to be refused the hand of a Dutch heiress is a certain step to high and dignified promotion in the state.
The cautious old gentleman knit his brows tenfold closer after these explanations, being sorely puzzled by the reasoning behind these pronouncements, while, methought, the one in pepper and salt eyed him with something of a triumphant leer.
At length, he observed that this was all very well, but he still thought the story a little on the extravagant. There were 1 or 2 points on which he had his doubts.
Faith, sir, replied the storyteller, as to that matter, I, Diedrich Knickerbocker, don't believe one half of it myself.